Have you ever heard the saying, to be so heavenly minded, they can be of no earthly good? Anyone heard that saying? Yeah, well, we could be in danger of that if we're not careful when we come to read from our series at the moment, from 2 Timothy. In the verses just before the ones that Nika's just read to us from 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 9 to 18, the Apostle Paul had been writing about how his life was coming to an end, how he would soon be pouring out his life. It was coming to an end, but he was so looking forward to that, in a sense, that he was going to be meeting with Christ. And he speaks about how he's looking forward on that day to receiving a reward for all that he's gone through in the service of Christ. And that certainly was, I often say, the big motivation to the New Testament church. Looking forward to that day when we'll be presented before Christ. That is, if you like, the goal. But if we focus just on that, then there is a real danger that we can become so heavenly minded that we become of no earthly good. And what we have in our reading that Nika's just brought us is really Paul back to earth, how the situation was and what he was struggling with and the problems he was facing. And Paul, at the time, was in Rome in prison. He was under a form of house arrest. If you had, like, to put it, simplify it, had his first hearing, and that's the one that's referred to in the passage, and he was awaiting, if you like, his second hearing and sentencing. So he was under very difficult circumstances. What we have in our passage is Paul describing what he needs now to cope in those situations he's in. Yes, he's got the heavenly focus. He knows where he's aiming to. He's got that hope for the future, which is right and proper and good. But he's also addressing the here and now. And we have to keep those two always in balance if we're going to cope with the world that we're in, if we are going to be effective, if we're not going to be so heavenly minded that now we're of no earthly use. And Paul, in this passage, points out 3 things that he needs. I'm going to really focus on the first one, but I will quickly cover the other 2. And the dangers that he faces. And the first problem he had was the danger of loneliness. Not just general loneliness, but actually spiritual loneliness. And in this passage, a few people are mentioned, and Nika, I should have warned you in advance of all these nasty names that they were there, names that we're not used to, but they're named here and they're named for a reason. Firstly, we've got Demas. Demas, who is described as having deserted me by Paul because he loves things of this life. You know, when I was first involved in the church, Demas used to get a lot of bad press because he deserted Paul because he loved this current life. And the impression was given that he was a man who'd come to the Christian faith, who'd been converted, who'd followed the faith, but then given up on it all, said, oh no, I'm not having anything more to do with that, and gone. And that was a sort of picture painted of Demas, which could have been the case, but it doesn't say that's the case here. It might equally as well have been the case that Demas was with Paul as a good Christian in Rome, but Rome was not a safe place for Christians to be. It might have been that he just got a bit overwhelmed with the fear. He was concerned about being publicly a Christian in Rome. He was concerned about being associated with Paul. So maybe he thought, well, I'm not giving up on the faith, but I'm definitely going to go somewhere else. So he went to Thessalonica, where of course there was a church. What was his failing? Well, his failing is he lost that focus on the bigger picture. He lost that heavenly that Paul was aiming to. The things of this life took over, whatever they were, and therefore he became unaffected. Now, that is affected. That is not the case of the other three people who are named. There's a chap mentioned, Crescens. We don't hear of anything else about him anywhere else in the New Testament, so we really know nothing about this guy other than what Paul says here, that he has gone to Galatia. In this situation, Galatia probably refers to Gaul in modern-day France. So here was a man who was serving with Paul, knew Paul could rely on, but now the time had come for him to go somewhere else. No suggestion that fear was a factor or anything else, or he'd taken his eye off the ball, but his life simply moved on and had taken him to Gaul in northern France. And that's about all we know about this chap, Crescens. The next one mentioned is Titus. We know a lot about him. Titus is one, rather like Timothy himself, who Paul was writing to here, worked with Paul a lot, was trusted by Paul, was known for his commitment to the Christian faith, and in the same way that Timothy had been put in charge of the church in Ephesus, so Titus was now put in charge, had been put in charge in the church of Crete. Now what it says here is Titus has now gone to Dalmatia. Now all we can consume from that is, yeah, he'd been given a job, he was having to work somewhere else for the gospel there in Crete. That project, if you like, has come to an end and he's gone on to the next assignment. It's a very good reason why he was no longer with Paul. And then we've got this chap mentioned, Tychicus. Tychicus I always think of as Paul's postman, because Tychicus is named in a lot of Paul's letters as the one who took the letter to the place. Tychicus took the letter to the Ephesians. He carried the letter to the Colossians. He carried the letter to Titus. And what we get from it about him here is he's now been sent to Ephesus. Presumably sent to Ephesus to take over from Timothy, who's running the church there, to release Timothy in order for him to return to Paul. So all these people are mentioned, but the critical thing is none of them were now with Paul. Paul was in real danger of spiritual isolation. Yes, if we were to have read on in the passage to the end of the chapter, some Christians in Rome are mentioned. Paul says, these folks send their greetings to you, Timothy. Now, they were presumably Christians in Rome who probably had visited Paul, but they weren't the people who'd worked with him in the past. They weren't the ones who'd really been alongside Paul in his work. What can we learn from this? Well, Paul was cut off. He was isolated spiritually from other believers with whom he'd worked. And loneliness is never a good thing. Whenever I think of that, I always think back to Genesis chapter 2. In Genesis chapter 1 and 2, we've got the story of creation, how God created the whole world. And in Genesis chapter 2, God's created the whole world, and he's created human beings. And everything he creates, he says, that is good, that is good, that is good. The one thing that he says specifically is not good is that the human being lives alone. It is not good for a person to be on their own. We need the company spiritually of other believers, just as in life we need the company of other people. At the end of this passage, Paul sends greetings to other believers who have worked with him in the past. Some really good people are mentioned, and you can look up in the New Testament and see how committed they were to the faith and the wonderful things that they'd done. Great, but those people weren't there. That's a really important lesson to us, I think. Now, over the years, I've known so many people say to me, oh, I'm a Christian, but I don't go to church. I used to go to church, but I don't any longer. But I'm still a Christian. I still have my belief. It's not good. It is never good for a person to be alone. People say to me, well, I used to go to church, but now I'm getting older, it's a little bit difficult and I don't go. There might be challenges, but it is not good. It is not good for a person to be alone. I always say, in the New Testament, we never read of a solitary Christian. This passage is the closest place we get to it with the Apostle Paul in prison, and it's not good. He's struggling with spiritual isolation. And I suppose people could say, well, these days I can go online. We can. We can join any service anywhere in the world, and it's a wonderful thing in a way that we can do that. But it's not good, because those people online are not the ones we know. They're not the believers we've worked with. They're not the believers we're struggling together. It is not the same thing. So, what happens in this situation? Paul asks Timothy to come to him, and what I really like is he asks him to bring Mark. Now, Mark is somebody who we do know about from the New Testament. He's a younger believer. In the Acts chapter 13, he was travelling with Paul and his companions on their first missionary journey. And he left them. He walked out on them. He went back to Jerusalem. That annoyed Paul, to put it mildly, to the extent that in Acts chapter 15, when they're planning a missionary journey again, Paul refuses to take Mark. Yet now in this passage he's saying to Timothy, bring Mark. Mark will be useful to me. I think that's really encouraging, because actually it shows us what discipleship, real discipleship, is like. Mark had changed over the years. Maybe as a younger believer he wasn't that good, but he is now. And I think that's really important when we're looking at Christian fellowship. It might be that in any Christian fellowship there are those who've irritated us in the past, those who've let us down, but actually they're still the people we need to be fellowshipping with. We need the company of other believers who've travelled with us. And part of their journey is, they struggled in the past and it was irritating to some of us, but see what God has done with their life now. Paul says, bring Mark with you. True fellowship is being together with those committed to the faith, who we've worked alongside, and encouraging one another as we face challenges in all that we do. That was the first practical need Paul states in order to stop being so heavenly minded that he's of no earthly use. Very quickly, the other two things he asks for is, he asks for his coat to be brought. Paul had practical needs. The coat would have been a single piece of fabric garment with a hole cut in the middle, and basically somebody wearing it would put it over their head and then wrap it round them to keep them warm. Winter was coming. Paul had practical needs, so he asked for support. He needed those needs addressing, and that's really important. We all have physical, practical needs, and we have to address those. We have to be open and honest about those needs if we're going to be of any earthly good. And the final thing he asks for, in our version of the Bible, it says, ask for the papers. It actually says the parchments. Parchments were, if you like, more durable than papyrus in early documents. They would probably have been either his copies of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, or maybe as well some of the letters that he's written that have become part of our Scriptures. What he was asking for is he wanted the Scriptures brought to him. That's important because as well as having practical needs, we all spiritually have intellectual needs. And this is the Apostle Paul. You know, this is the great teacher. This is the great theologian. Even at the later stages of his life, he still needed that intellectual stimulus. He still needed to be reading the scriptures daily. He still needed to be challenging his thinking. He needed that for his spiritual survival. So we have practical needs. We have equally so intellectual needs that must be met. And it's always worth asking, if Paul needed that, how are we meeting our spiritual intellectual needs? How do we ensure that we don't become so heavenly minded that we're no earthly use? Simply by this, making sure we maintain and enjoy the company of other Christian believers who we've worked with, who we travel with. We need their company. Making sure that we focus on meeting our practical needs when those needs are real, and making sure that we meet our spiritual, intellectual needs.